Well, hello, and once again, welcome to our little campfire. Kind of hang around here and tell stories and enjoy company and, all kinds of things. But this is a fun time, and the weather's getting pretty nice. By golly, spring is coming quick, so it makes these enjoyable. Yeah, you can last a little longer into the night without getting quite so cold, and the fire's just as special. So sit down and join us. And tonight, let's get started here. I'm going to tell you some more story from The Coyote by James Roberts. You know that Coyote. He's an outlaw, and seems that he's a pretty nice guy. He just keeps falling into some trouble, works his way out of it a little bit, falls back into it. So let's get started on Channel 26, The Prodigal. With face upraised to the breath of air which stirred across them bare black lava hills, wrath-burned, he leaned forward in the saddle eagerly, while his dun-colored horse stood patiently, seemingly in accord with his master's mood. A merciless sun beat down from a hot, cloudless sky. And below, stretching in endless miles, was the desert, a sinister, forbidding land of desolate distances, marked only by slender yucca plums and mesquite, dusty greasewood, an occasional clump of green palo verde, the slim fingers of the octillo, the high forks of the giant saguaro, and clumps of la cholla cactus looking like apple orchards in full bloom. Yet the man's gaze fell for a moment lovingly on each species of cactus and desert vegetation. His look was that which dwells in the homesick eyes of a traveler when he sees his native land from the deck of an inbound ship. "Hoss, we're home," he said aloud while the animal pricked up its ears. Then he looked off to the left where the blue outlines of a low range of mountains wavered in the heat like a mirage. "Well, Imagination Range," he said moodily. He tickled the dun with his spurs and trotted along the crest of the lava ridge. At its eastern terminus he swung down into the desert and struck straight east in the direction of Imagination Range. The desert surface between the lava ridges and the higher hills of the range to the eastward was cut by dry washes and arroyos and miniature ridges studded with giant cactus. And on the top of one of these high rises, the horseman suddenly reined in his mount and stared into the south. "There's trouble, and spelled with a capital T," he ejaculated. The gaze in his keen eyes centered upon a number of riders speeding their horses over the tumbled section of desert below him and to the right. He made out two divisions of horsemen, one group with some distance ahead of the others. Even as he stared down at them, its group separated, and some of them rode for Imagination Range, while others hastened toward the lava hills or due north into his direction. The second group halted for a brief spell, evidently for a conference, and then its members also divided and started in swift pursuit of the men ahead of them. The watcher on the top of the rise frowned to himself. "Out of here, Hoss," he said sharply. "This ain't our day for visitors." Well, he pushed on eastward, increasing its pace, but losing time in skirting the frequent bits of high ground. As he rode down into a deep arroyo, a horseman came galloping into its lower end and raced almost upon him before seeing him. His hand darted like lightning to his gun, and the weapon snapped into aim at his hip. The horseman came to a rearing halt, reins a-dangling, his hands held high, his eyes bulging from their sockets. "Rathburn!" he exclaimed. "The same," said the man with the gun. "What's all that disturbance down there?" "How, Bob Long is chasing us," the other answered with a nervous grin. "As I remember it," drawled Rathburn, "Bob Long now, he's the sheriff of Mesquite County. You boys sure ain't been misbehaving?" "It's worse than that," said the fugitive, staring doubtfully at his questioner. "The stage driver's dead. Had a notion that boss was foolin' when he told him to reach up for the bugs in the air." "Well, who does the boss happen to be in this case?" The man hesitated. "Take your time," said Rathburn sarcastically. "There ain't nobody after you but the sheriff, and he probably won't be along for a minute or two." It won't do you no good for him to find us here, said the other boldly. Rathburn's eyes blazed at him. I reckon you're forgetting that Bob Long knows I travel alone, he said hotly. He savvies I don't travel with a crowd. I ain't found it necessary so far, and I ain't aiming to start. I counted 8 in your gang to hold up one stage, huh? He concluded with a sneer, while the other shifted nervously in his saddle and cast a quick look back over his shoulder. There seemed no one there. You needn't be looking around, Rathburn said coldly. You're going to stay right here till you answer my question. If all the sheriffs in Arizona come riding up in the meantime. Now, who's heading your gang up? Well, that ain't professional, the fugitive grumbled. You're just the same as one of us. Then, seeing the look that came into Rathburn's eyes, he said hastily, Mike Egan planned to lay. I guessed it, said Rathburn in a tone of contempt. Well, you better slope while you still got a chance. He motioned to the man to go, and the latter rode at a gallop up the arroyo and out of sight. Rathburn's face wore a worried scowl as he slid his gun into its holster, whirled his horse, and speedily climbed the east side of the arroyo. From a vantage point he caught sight again of the horsemen racing up from the south. They were much closer now, and he could readily make out the members of the sheriff's posse. He'd had experience with posses before. Striking around the crest of the high ground which formed the east side of the arroyo, he again raced toward that range of mountains in the east, taking advantage of every bit of cover which offered concealment from the riders that were approaching at top speed from the south. Occasional glances made it plain that the sheriff was sending, or personally bringing, most of his posse east in the direction of the mountains, presumably in the hope of cutting off the outlaws from seeking refuge in those hills. But the mountains were Rathburn's goal as well as the goal of a majority of Mike Egan's band, though for totally different reasons. He refused to change his direction, although by going north, the stout, speedy Dunn could doubtless outdistance the posse before the afternoon was spent. Rathburn's teeth snapped shut, his jaw squared, and his eyes narrowed as he saw inaudible signs that he had been detected. 2 of the posse now were waving their arms and dashing in his direction. At that distance, they could not identify him, but under the circumstances, such identification was unnecessary. His presence there, riding like mad, was going to be convincing to the pursuers that he was one of the gang responsible for that stage job. Now, this was obvious. And for good reasons. Rathburn did not want it generally known that he was back in a country where he had spent most of his life and where he was branded as a desperate outlaw with a big price on his head. Consequently, seeing that the sheriff's men were out to get him, he abandoned all attempts at concealment, drove in his spurs, gave the dun horse its head, and raced for the mountains. The other members of the posse who were farther to the east, they caught the signals of the 2 that were in hot pursuit of Rathburn, and they dashed to the north to cut him off. The outlaws had disappeared, and Rathburn shook his head savagely as he realized they had sought cover when they saw the chase was directed at one man. Without having had a hand in the hold-up of the stage, he had arrived on that spot just in time to draw the fire of the authorities. And fire it was now, for the men behind him had begun shooting in the hope of a chance hit at that distance. A scant mile separated him from his goal. He came to a level stretch which was almost a mass of green because of the clumps of Palo Verde. And here he urged the dun to its utmost, outdistanced the pair in his rear, and gained on the men riding from the south, almost ahead of him. He swerved just a bit to the north and cut straight for a notch in the mountains. He smiled as he approached it, and saw a narrow defile leading into the hills. He gained it in a final heartbreaking burst of speed on the part of his mount. As he dashed into the canyon, bullets sang past him and over his head. Then a cry of amazement come to his ears. "It's the Coyote!" a man was yelling. "Rathburn's back!" Well, he dashed into the shelter of the death-hill, and a grim smile playing on his lips. He had been recognized. His face hardened. He rounded a huge boulder, checked his horse, and dismounted. He could hear the pound of hooves at the entrance of the narrow canyon, and a rider came into view below. Rathburn leaned out from the protection of the boulder. His lips were pressed into a fine white line, and there was a look of haunted worry in his eyes. His gun flashed in his hand. The rider saw him and yelled, spurring his horse. Then Rathburn's gun swung quickly upward. A sharp report sounded like a crack of thunder in the narrow confines of the canyon, and its echoes reverberated through the hills. The rider toppled in his saddle and fell to the floor of the canyon. His horse came to a snorting stop, reins a-dangling, all four legs braced. The hoof-beats instantly were stalled. A silence, complete and sinister, reigned in the defile. Rathburn slipped his smoking gun into his holster and mounted noiselessly. Then he walked his horse slowly up the canyon, sitting sidewise in the saddle to keep a vigil on the trail behind. A minute later he heard a volley of shots below and the signal to all the scattered members of the posse to race to the entrance of the canyon. He increased his pace, broke his gun, extracted the empty shell, and inserted a fresh cartridge in its place. Chapter 27. The Desert Code. Keeping to the trail, Rathburn mounted higher and higher and spoke continually to his horse in a crooning tone of encouragement. His face was drawn in grim lines. His eyes were constantly alert. His very posture in the saddle showed that his nerves were at high tension. He ignored dim paths which occasionally led off to the left or to the right in rifts in the sheer black walls of that narrow canyon. No sound come to him from below. He knew that the posse would have to proceed with the utmost caution, for the sheriff and his men could not be sure that they would not encounter him at some bend in the trail. They would be expecting shots from every boulder, for Rathburn had let them know he had no intention of being taken easily or alive. And the afternoon wore on, and Rathburn steadily penetrating the very heart of imagination range. Finally, he swung out of the canyon trail and took a dim path to the right. He dismounted and walked back to rub off the scars left by his horse's shoes on the rock floor of that side trail. Satisfied he'd leave the members of the posse confused as to which side trail he'd taken, he'd returned to his horse, mounted, and proceeded up that narrow trail leading to the top of the range to the south of the deep canyon. In the western sky, the sun was low when he rode down the crest of the range. The mountains were devoid of vegetation, bleak, and bare, and black. The lava rock seemed to absorb the heat of the sun and throw it back into the rider's face. But Rathburn didn't appear to mind it. He crossed the backbone of the range and began the descent on the eastern side. But he descended only a short distance before he swung out of the saddle. From the slicker pack on the rear of the saddle, he took out a pair of heavy leather gloves. He cut these open in his palms with his pocket knife, and then he tied them about the shoes of his horse's hind feet. The dun was only shod behind. Again he mounted, and this time he turned to the south and rode down a long slope of lava rock. He grunted with satisfaction as he looked behind and saw that the leather had prevented the shoes on his mount's hind feet from leaving a scar. He was completely obliterating his trail, leaving nothing at all for the posse to follow, if they should trace him to the top of the range. He walked his horse slowly, for the dun did not like the idea of the leather tied to its hooves. In less than 2 miles, the leather was worn plumb through upon the hard rock, and he got down and removed the remnants. He straightened up, and he looked out over the vista of the desert. The western sky was a sea of gold. Far to southward, a curl of smoke rose upward, making the course of a railroad and a town. Rathburn looked long in this direction with a dreamy, wistful light in his eyes. Close at hand, vegetation appeared upon the slope of the hills. His gaze darted here and there along the ridges below him, and his parted lips and eager attitude showed unmistakably that he was familiar with every rod of the locality in which he found himself. Again he climbed into the saddle and turned off to the left, entering a canyon. For better than half a mile he proceeded down this way, and Then he rode eastward again, winding in and out of a network of canyons, until he came to this rock-ribbed crest of a ridge which overlooked an oasis in the desert hills. There was green vegetation where the water from a spring seeped into the floor of the canyon below him. The spring, it was nothing more than a huge cup in the rock which had caught the water from the spring rains and filled, and above the spring was a small cabin, and Rathburn saw that the cabin door was open. Hurriedly he rode down a trail to the right which circled around into the canyon from its lower end. As he galloped towards the spring, a figure appeared in the doorway of the cabin. Rathburn waved an arm and dismounted at the spring. He led his horse to the drink. Then as a man came walking toward him from the cabin, he compelled the dun to drink slowly, first to swallow, and now two, then a few more. Finally, he drew that horse away from the water. "Yeah, you can have a little more a little later," he said cheerfully. "Hello, Joe Price." The man walked up to him without a great show of surprise and held out his hand. He was bareheaded, and the hair which hung down on his shoulders was snow white. His face was seamed and lined, burnt by the sun of 80 Arizona summers, and the small blue eyes twinkled. "Hang me with a busted shoestring if it ain't Rathburn," said the old man. "Why, boy, you're just in time for supper. Put your horse up behind the cabin and get in at the table. She's a big country, all full of cactus, but the old man's got grub left." Rathburn laughed, rinsed his mouth out with water, and dipped from the spring in a battered tin cup and took a swallow before he replied. "Joe, there's two things I want. Grub and gaff. I know you've got grub, or you wouldn't be here, but I don't know if you're any good at the gaff anymore." The old man scrutinized him close. "You look some older," he said finally. "Not much of the wild gallootin' kid left in you, I expect, but don't go getting fresh with me or I'll clout you with one of my prospecting picks. Now, go long now, put up your horse and hustle inside. If you wants to wash up, I guess you can, being a visitor." Rathburn chuckled as he led his horse around behind the cabin where two burros were, and unsaddled him. Before he entered the cabin, he stood for a moment looking up the ridge down which he had come. The old man watched him but made no comment. As Rathburn sat down to the table, however, he spoke. "You know, I can hear anybody coming down that trail over the ridge while their chute's still a mile away," he said simply, without looking up. Rathburn flashed a look of admiration at the old man. The glow of the sunset lit the hills with crimson fire, and the light breeze stirred with the advent of the long, colorful desert twilight. They ate together in silence, washing down the hearty food with long draughts of strong coffee. The old man asked no questions of his friend. He knew that in time Rathburn would talk. A man's business in that desolate land of dreadful distances was his own, save such of it as he wanted to tell. Now that was the desert code. Supper over, they went out to a little bench in front of the cabin. And there it was. Joe Price lit his pipe, and Rathburn rolled himself a cigarette. For some time, they just smoked in silence. The purple twilight drifted over the hills, and the breeze freshened in welcome relief to the heat of the day. "Joe, I just had to come back," said Rathburn softly. "Something's wrong with me. You wouldn't think I'd get homesick this way after all the trouble I've had here, would you?" The old man removed his pipe. "Anybody here in particular you want to see?" he asked slowly. Rathburn shrugged at that. "You're always getting right down to cases, first hand off and running," he complained. "Of course there's folks I want to see. I want to see you, for instance." "Well, I don't reckon you'd be riding any terrible great distance and taking chances by the handfuls just to see me, boy," said Price. "But I ain't trying to pry into your affairs. You don't have to answer any of the fool questions I ask you. You know that. I'm an old man and getting childish." Rathburn laughed. "I can believe that when I find you still puttering around up here where there ain't even sign of mineral," he chided. And there's gold right under your feet, said the old man stoutly. I'll have a paying vein opened up here in less than 3 months. God, I hope so, Joe. There's nobody I'd like more to see make a big strike than you. You were my dad's friend, and you've been mine, and I haven't got many friends, Joe. But them you've got is good ones, said Price quickly. How long you been away? Well, about 8 months, Rathburn replied with a frown. That's hard to get away from this desert, mused the old man. It's in your blood. If you leave here for good, you've just naturally got to take something along with you from here. Something that's a part of the desert, you might say. Rathburn looked keenly at the face of his friend. But the old man was regarding his pipe as if he had never, until that moment, seen it. Now I ran into a posse chasing a gang that robbed a stage on the way over here this noon, Rathburn said presently. Price's interest quickened, but he made no sign. They saw you? Yeah, I couldn't help it, Rathburn grumbled. Took after me. Yeah, I had to drop one of 'em with a bullet in the shoulder to slow him up in that long canyon over on the other side. You know any of the gang? Price asked him. Yeah, I met one. Threw down my gun on him. He told me Mike Egan's was running the works. Price nodded. Yeah, I reckon Mike's been pulling quite a few stunts while you've been away. And I've been getting the blame for 'em more than likely, said Rathburn in indignation. Price nodded again. Might be so. Rathburn looked up at him in understanding. You know, they'll have me all mixed up with this here stage hold-up, he said earnestly. From what I gathered, they killed the driver, and then they'll say that was my part. That's the trouble, boy, said the old miner. If a fella's handy with his gun, somebody's sure to get jealous of him and make him draw. And if he gets his man because he has to, why, he's a killer. When he's known as a killer, he ain't got a chance. You had to drop the 2 men you dropped around here, boy, but they ain't forgetting it. Bob Long was heading up that posse, said Rathburn thoughtfully. And Bob Long's a sticker when he hits out on a man's trail, said Price. Still, I guess you'd be safe in here for a while. There ain't many that knows this place. Yeah, I don't figure on staying here long, Joe, said Rathburn. Yeah, didn't think you did, said Price. I'll have to get going, hit for new country, and never know when I may run up against the law in a quarter where I ain't expecting it. Always sneaking along, like the Coyote. It was Mike Egan who gave me that name, Joe. Rathburn's voice was low and vibrant. The old man felt the menacing quality in it. What's more, Rathburn went on, I'm always remembering that he's back here, getting away with his dirty tricks and shoving the blame off on me, some way or another, when the chase gets hot. For some time the old man was silent, and when he spoke he put an arm around Rathburn's shoulder. Boy, before you get worse mixed up than you are, there's a place you ought to visit round here, he said in a fatherly tone. Rathburn shrugged and stared up at the night sky, which was blossoming with stars. It would be a right smart risk, Price went on, for they'd maybe think to drop around that way on a lookout for you. But I reckon before you do much more, you better drop in at the Mallory place. Rathburn rose abruptly. I guess that's what I came up here to hear you say, he said irritably. But I don't reckon it can be done, Joe. I haven't any business there. How do you know, boy? Maybe you ain't being right fair. Seems to me it would look better for me to stay away. Well, they don't have to see you, urged the old man. The Mallory place is a good 15 miles from Hope, close up agin the mountains. Boy, don't you think you better make sure? The wistful, yearning look was back in Rathburn's eyes. His right hand rested upon the butt of his gun. The other held his forgotten cigarette. He turned and looked into the old man's eyes. Joe, you said something about taking something from the desert if I left it. You're right. But it can't be, Joe. This thing has killed my chances. The gun seemed to leap from its holster into his hand at his hip of its own accord, and the old miner's brows lifted in astonishment at the draw. If I was you, I wouldn't be much scared who I met on the way down to the Mallory place if I didn't meet too many of 'em at once," he said with a smile. I couldn't wear it there," said Rathburn, faltered. "Well, leave it hanging on a handy peg, boy," said the old man cheerfully. Rathburn jammed the gun back into its holster and walked around to his horse, led the animal down to drink, and then returned and saddled. "You going on tonight?" said Price casually. "I'm taking a ride," Rathburn confessed. "Well, you ain't taking my advice at the same time, are you?" asked Price, pretending to be greatly concerned. Rathburn mounted and looked down upon him in the faint light of the stars. "Joe Price, you're a wise old desert rat, and I'm a young fool." He said that with a twinkle in his gray eyes. "If Bob Long happens this way, give him my regards and tell him they got the reward notices over there in California all right, for I saw 'em stuck up over there. So long." The old miner gave a wave and called out after him and watched him ride down the canyon and disappear into the shadows. Nor was he the only watcher, for high on the ridge above another man touched his horse with his spurs and started down the west side of the range as Rathburn vanished. Chapter 28. A Night Summons. In 2 hours, Rathburn came to a fence about a small ranch. Cattle were grazing on the sparse feed within the enclosure, and he saw a clump of trees marking the site of a house. He rode around the fence until he come to a gate. There was a light shining from 2 of the windows of the house. He passed through the gate, and as he approached the house from the side, he saw 2 figures on the porch. He halted in the shelter of the trees, and as one of the figures crossed the beam of light which shone out the door, he saw that it was a man. He obtained a fleeting look at the man's face. He was comparatively young, not bad looking, with blue eyes and a small, close-cropped, sandy mustache. Rathburn scratched his head in an effort to place the man. He seemed vaguely familiar. Now Rathburn was sure he'd seen him somewhere, but he gave up the futile effort to identify him, and when he saw that the other figure on the porch was that of a girl. Dismounting, he led his horse around to the rear and put him in a corral near the barn. He surmised that it was probably about 10 o'clock. And as he walked toward the front of the house again, he heard the sputtering of a small motor car. Then he saw the path of light from its headlights go streaking across the desert in the direction of the town to the southward. The front door closed, and all was still. Rathburn hesitated for several moments, then he stamped up the porch steps and knocked at the door. It was opened by a girl. She held a lighted lamp in her hand. When she saw Rathburn standing, hat in hand, before her, her dark eyes widened, and she nearly dropped the lamp. He stepped forward quickly and took it from her. "Roger!" she exclaimed breathlessly. "You? Here?" "I'm here, Laura," he said quietly. "I'm home on a visit." "I heard you were back," she faltered. "Mr. Doane, that is, a gentleman from town, told me he had heard that you were back," but she scanned his face closely and peered beyond him into the shadows with a visible concern. "Roger, come in quickly," she invited, stepping back from the door. With a faint smile, he entered and closed the door after him. He put the lamp down on the table in what was evidently the sitting room of the small house. He looked about him with an air of one who sees familiar surroundings, but is embarrassed by them. "Someone been telling you the details of my arrival?" he asked with an effort to appear casual. "I heard you were in some trouble, Roger." The girl continued to stare at him with a queer expression in her fine eyes. Part sorrow, part concern, and part gladness. "Well, I'm not a stranger to trouble these days, Laura," he said soberly. There was a sob in the girl's throat, but she recovered herself at once. "Have you eaten?" she asked quickly. "Up at Joe Price's pace," he replied. "All fed and chipper." There was not much confidence in his tone or his manner, and as the girl lowered her gaze, he looked at her hungrily. His eyes feasted on the coils of dark curls, her long black lashes, the curve of her cheek and her delicate color, The full ruby lips, the small quivering chin. She was in the throes of a strong emotion. "I'm sorry, Laura, if you didn't want me to come," he said unsteadily. "Oh, Roger, of course we want you to come. It's been so long since we saw you, and you've gone through so much." She raised her eyes, and the expression in which he saw in their depths caused him to look away and bite his lips. "There's a lot of it I wish I could undo, Laura, and there's a lot more of it I couldn't help, and maybe some I wasn't—" Why, he paused there. He couldn't help but bring himself to say anything in extenuation of himself and his acts in the presence of this girl. It might sound as if he were playing for her sympathy, he thought to himself. "Roger, I know you haven't done all the things I've heard about," she said bravely. "And there's always a chance. You're a man. You can find a way out. If the trails seem all twisted and tangled, you can use a compass. Your own conscience, Roger, you still have that." "How did you happen to mention the trails being all mixed up like that?" he asked curiously. "Why, I don't know. Isn't that the way it seems?" Rathburn looked away with a frown. "You come near hitting the nail on the head, Laura." "Oh, then you are beginning to think," she said eagerly. "I've done nothing but think for months," Rathburn confessed. She looked at him searchingly. Then her eyes dropped to the black butt of the gun in the holster strapped on his right thigh. She shuddered slightly. "Did you come from the west, Roger?" she asked him. "Yeah," he replied shortly. "From where there's water and timber and flowers and grass. But they had my number there, just the same as they've got it here. I'm a marked man, Laura Mallory." She leaned upon the table with one hand, and the other she held upon her breast. Are they after you, Roger?" she asked in a low, anxious tone. "As usual," he answered with a vague laugh. "Laura, I didn't come here to bother you with my troubles. I came here just to see you." The girl colored at that. "I know, Roger. We've known each other a long time, since we were children. You wouldn't like it for me not to show any concern over your troubles, would you?" "I wish we could talk about something else," said Rathburn. "I can't stay long." Laura Mallory looked worried. "May I ask where you plan to go, Roger?" I'm not sure. I only know I wanted to come back, and I came. I hadn't any fixed plans, and I wasn't expecting the reception I got." His face clouded. Then he looked straight into the girl's eyes. "I hit this country this morning," he said steadily. "The first folks I saw was some men riding in my direction up between the lava hills and the range. Then things began to happen." She nodded brightly. "I believe you," she said simply. Rathburn smiles. "You always did that, Laura, and I ain't never been much of a hand at lying. Roger," she said quickly, "if they all knew you as well as I think I know you, and—" "They wouldn't believe," he interrupted. "They call me the Coyote, and they'll have me live up to the name whether I want to or not," he added bitterly. "But, Roger, you're forgetting what I said about the trails and the compass." "No, Laura, I'm not. But there's another force besides the big lodestones that affect in that compass. Roger, you're thinking of an enemy." He did not answer her. His face appeared grim, almost haggard in the yellow eyes of the lamplight. "Roger, you once promised me anything I might ask," she said softly. "And all you have to do is ask," he answered, taking a step towards her. "I'm going to ask you for something, Roger," she said without looking at him. "And maybe you'll think it's too much that I ask." She glanced up at him doubtfully. "Well, what is it, Laura?" he insisted. "I want your gun, Roger," she whispered. He straightened and he stared at her in startled wonder. "But, Laura, a man in my position, why, where would I be at?" "Maybe if you gave it to me, it would help you find a way out, Roger," she pleaded earnestly. Rathburn looked into her eyes and thrilled. Then without a word he unbuckled his cartridge belt, which held his holstered pistol, untied the strap about his thigh, and laid the belt with the weapon upon the table. "Roger," said the girl. The sob again was in her voice. She reached out and placed a hand upon his arm. An elderly man appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. "Father, this is Roger," said the girl hurriedly. "He's back." "What's that? Roger, eh? You mean Rathburn's here?" The old man peered at the visitor from the doorway. His lean face was twitching. He stroked his gray beard in indecision. His blue eyes looked long at Rathburn and then at the girl, and lastly at the gun and the belt on the table. "Well, hello, Rathburn," he said finally, advancing into the room. He held out a hand, which Rathburn grasped. "Did you eat yet?" asked Mallory. "In the hills with Joe Price," replied Rathburn. "But I'm just as much obliged." Yes, of course," Mallory muttered. "With Joe, huh? He ain't been down in months. How is he?" "Looks good as a gold mine and thinks he's found one," said Rathburn, looking at the girl's father curiously. "That's what keeps him up," Mallory asserted loudly. "He'll never get old as long as he thinks he's got a mine corralled. He ought to try stock raising for a while. You look older, Rathburn, more filled out. Are you still cutting them high, wide, and handsome?" Rathburn's face clouded. "Roger's starting new, Dad," the girl interposed. Mallory stared keenly at the younger man. He started to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of horses outside the house. Rathburn whirled towards the door, took a step, and stopped in his tracks. The girl's hands flew to the sides of her face, and her eyes widened with apprehension. "I'll go see who it is," said Mallory, with a quick look at Rathburn. He hastened out into the kitchen, and a moment later he heard the kitchen door open. There was a murmur of voices. The girl stared at Rathburn breathlessly while he tapped with his slim fingers upon the top of the table. Then Mallory came in. "Somebody to see you," he said to Rathburn. Rathburn looked once at the white-faced girl and followed her father out into the kitchen. She heard him speak in an undertone, and then Rathburn came back into the room. "I ain't much elated over my visitor," he said slowly. "I wished you hadn't asked me what you did until this caller had come and gone." She looked straight into his eyes in an agony of dread. "Who is it, Roger?" she asked, wetting her lips. "Mike Egan is out there," he answered calmly. She drew a quick breath while he waited. Then he turned on his heel and started for the kitchen door. "Roger!" she called. He swung about and eyed her questioningly. She pointed at the heavy belt and the gun on the table. "Take it," she whispered. He buckled on the belt and tied down the end of the holster so it would not slip if he should draw the weapon within it. Then he made his way into the kitchen and out the rear door. Laura Mallory sank into a chair, sobbing. Well, there you go. What kind of trouble's he in now? What's he going to do? Looks like he's got some bad blood out there, and this Egan feller. Well, he'll find a way to get in trouble again and work his way out of it and do some good in the process. And let's tell some more stories next time we get together. That was fun. All right, everybody. Till I see you again, this is Clay Steele. Good night.